Impact of the New Deal. When we look at the lasting impact of the New Deal, it's important to remember that the New Deal alone did not end the Great Depression. What the New Deal does is help a lot of Americans deal with the hard times of the 1930s. More importantly, when we look at the lasting impact of the New Deal, we want to remember that the New Deal makes some major changes to our government and some major changes to America that still affect us today. One way is the New Deal introduces some new rights to Americans. When we think about the rights that Americans have always had since the Bill of Rights, we think of freedom of speech, we think of freedom of religion, we think of being guaranteed a trial by jury. With the advent of the New Deal, Americans are given the right to economic security. All Americans have a right to a job. They have a right to decent wages. They have a right to a decent home and medical care and good education. Now, before the New Deal, people had these things, but quite often it was private charities like churches or the Salvation Army or Goodwill that tried to help people obtain these rights of economic security. But since the New Deal, it's really been the government's job, more or less, to protect that right to economic security. The New Deal also creates a welfare state, and that's not a dirty word. When we say welfare state, what that means is it's a system where the government takes responsibility for the economic well-being of its citizens. And our government first started this during the New Deal, during the Great Depression, with Social Security. This woman's getting her Social Security check in the mail. Now, unlike the other relief efforts of the New Deal, Social Security was not short-term. This lasts for the rest of people's lives, and this program still exists today. Since the New Deal, the welfare state has grown. The federal government has taken on the responsibility of health insurance for some Americans, has taken on food stamp programs for some Americans, has provided money for farmers. These are examples of what we call entitlement programs. And what that means is these are programs where people get money or assistance in some form from the government if they meet a certain criteria. Social Security is also an entitlement program. My grandmother gets a Social Security check. Why? Because she's old enough to qualify for it. The New Deal also changes the size and will eventually get to the role of the government. The old way, the traditional American way, was that we had a small government. By comparison, we had a very small government, and that meant a very cheap government. And it was a government that didn't get too involved in people's lives. But after the New Deal, many Americans agree that it's the government's responsibility to fix the economy. We can use the government to fix the economy. And that means the government's going to get involved in the economy. And we can also use the government to improve society. For example, helping old people with Social Security. Now, all of these new programs are going to need new agencies, new people to do these new tasks. And that means that this new government after the New Deal and since the New Deal is going to cost more than that small government America had before. The New Deal also leads to what we would call deficit spending. That is defined as when the government borrows money because everything that the government does costs more than the government brings in taxes. The state of Ohio is not allowed to do this. The city of Delaware is not allowed to do this. But the federal government is allowed to use what's called deficit spending. So they sell bonds to borrow money to cover the difference between how much money they bring in taxes and how much money is actually being spent. Deficit spending is a big part of the opinions on big government that have formed in the wake of the New Deal. Conservatives criticize big government. They say that government has too many regulations, that it has too high a taxes, and that this big federal government leads to less local and state control. On the flip side, liberals would be more supportive of big government. Liberals would say that it's okay for government to be big. We need a far-reaching government to create a good and fair society. And finally, as a result of the New Deal, the government does a lot of things it never did before. Now, most Americans, especially people here in Delaware, buy their power from electric companies. But in some parts of our nation, especially down in the Tennessee area, people buy their electrical power from the government. Also, our money in the bank, our savings accounts, are insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That's a part of the federal government. That's something the government never did before. Our investments in the stock market are protected by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Before the New Deal, the government never got involved in the stock market that much. And many Americans receive Social Security when they retire. All of these are things that were implemented with the New Deal.